Hi guys, welcome again. We'll be soon starting with our first session. We're kicking off today's sessions with a topic that underpins all of climate action, which is critical thinking and credible research. Please join me in welcoming Shravan Shankar, who's the co-founder of Climake, who will be speaking on the climate research mindset tools for analytical thinking. In this session, Shravan will be taking us through how to authenticate resources, how a lot of role that sample spaces play, how to translate data that has been primarily syndicated for the global north and how to make it suit the global south realities better, and research frameworks, and plus a few very practical tips on how to retain and process insights from long-term reports. So we'll have 45 minutes of presentation followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, which is the standard format we go for. So please keep your questions ready as we come towards the end of the session. So let's dive into Shravan. All over to you, Shravan. Looking forward.
Just give me 1 second. I've got a bunch of tabs. I'm just going to reduce this. Give me a second. Oops, sorry. Okay. So just give me 1 second. I kind of lost the tab. Okay, yes, on the tab. Hey. Hi everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks, Deshna. I was really like what you're looking to do here, so I'm quite keen to see how we can actually support the group. I think there's one thing instead of I want to make this a conversational thing because to be honest to you, I've got a few slides, but it's not much. But I think just to make it more, two-way, I'm happy for you to stop me at any point of time, ask me questions as and when you see fit, rather than leaving it to the end. I would just prefer, I think it's more suitable for such a conversation to be in this particular conversation to be in this format. I hope that's fine for all of you. So basically, you can just stop me at any point of time and you can have a conversation and ask questions accordingly. Does that work? I can't see the screen, so you guys will have to give me a percent.
Yes, that works.
Okay, super. All right. I think when Deshna asked me to do this talk, it actually made me think of whether I'm actually a climate researcher or not, because traditionally that's not, I've never identified myself as that. But climate research is pretty fundamental to the work that I do. Okay. And I kind of want to take it through kind of a background of the context of what we are dealing with around climate finance and why research is such a key component to it. And I also want to just give you a flavor of how at least I go about this particular topic. I will be very candid and honestly saying I don't have a, all my research skills have come through just practice by experience. I don't have a, formal sort of, what a research degree might be. I haven't even done a PhD or a master's, for example. So, but what I found is it's basically helped me in defining one very key thing, which is messaging, which is around when you take a piece of content, you take a piece of information, how do you actually end up conveying that in a particular way that's actually useful? And I think the point of something being useful goes to the heart of a lot of things around what we do. Okay, so I want to give you a bit of an idea about what I do, because research, now I realize when I kind of was going through this presentation, is a very fundamental part of that. Okay. So this is me. I run an organization called Climake. We focus on how do you bring in more capital into the climate space. As all of you know, the climate space is very nascent. You leave aside renewables, even mobility to some extent. The rest of the space is significant unknown to many people. And fundamentally, the role, and this is why research is pretty critical to the whole piece. What research does is that it actually starts filling in the gaps that we need to figure out to see what do we exactly have to do towards enabling climate action. Take even the whole basis of 1.5 degree and 2 degrees and so on. This is a culmination of us having gone through many cycles of understanding so many facets, so many aspects about how emissions are created, what the impact is of all these things, and then coming into this. So research and where climate finance is today, at least climate finance research is today, is in the space of basically filling in a lot of gaps which are not there. When you kind of contrast this to other sectors, for example, very often you'll see that what research does is it can be to solidify something. It can be to push forward a particular boundary further, or it can be to basically review a lot of what has happened before and then look at how do we really take things forward from that. So sort of reviewing learnings and from the learnings, taking things forward. But climate finance is not really like that. And I kind of get into this why. So this is kind of a very loose structure that I have. I will be honest that I was a bit pressed for time. So for the last 2 points, for example, I have some slides that I want to sort of just start the conversation on, but I will be more than happy for you guys to actually reach out and ask questions, and then we can have a conversation around that. But let me just get started with the first part of things. So the way we look at climate finance research is that it has to definitely do one thing. If it doesn't do this one thing, it's not useful. And that's basically to provide better direction that supports improved decision making. Now, why I mentioned this thing of better direction goes back to what I said, that climate finance is often a black hole for a lot of people. Climate action is a black hole for a lot of people. Now, at a very fundamental level, climate finance follows what the need for climate action is. What I mean by that is the amount of money and capital that we need is very dependent on the action that we're going to take. So if the action requires an innovation to be developed, then you know that we need innovation capital to support that. But if the action required is taking something which is already technologically validated and scaling that up, then we know we need scale capital for that. Very simplistic thing. But what the research element of climate finance should do is to ensure that you're providing direction towards that. Okay. Okay, I actually had a better slide for this. Okay. So what do we mean by improved decision making? On one angle, it's climate finance, because it's a function of how things are evolving, is to understand how our sector is going to grow. It involves understanding what is the technology aspect of maturity, what our market adoption is like, what is potential policy direction like, and only then do we actually talk about what is the financing need for it. So when we talk about climate finance, we ultimately are doing a lot of work around climate innovation, research around that. We're doing a lot of work around impact understanding of climate effects. And only then are we actually in a space and are we capable of actually talking about climate finance. Now, this is my perspective of how I view this whole thing. And the second understand, which is not complete there, is around the whole technology angle that I just expected. And only then do you actually then start filling in the gaps around, okay, saying if the need for saying like, we need adoption of battery storage systems to scale significantly. Now, the gap in that is at this current point of time is not necessary. To some extent, it's a technology gap because we can't just look at lithium ion, we have to look at flow batteries. So there's a technology gap of how do we actually understand that becoming commercially viable. And then there's another element on the research element on who exactly is the market for this. And also there's a timeline gap for us to figure out at what stage that is actually happening. And from that only can we actually figure out and say, this is the sort of capital that is required. Is it available? If it's not available, then there's another research which is required around what sort of structures are necessary. And that element of what structures are necessary is a significantly deep hole, because at that point of time, you're almost doing thesis development. You're almost making the case for why such a structure has to evolve. Why should it actually exist? But fundamentally, anything that happens around research and climate finance is about improving decision making. If it does not improve decision making, and at this point of time, I believe it's around providing better direction. If you're not able to do that, then it's not an effective piece of research. Simple as that. Okay. And yeah, so like I was saying, this is fundamentally the elements that you start having to understand. So when I do any climate finance piece, this is all the things that I have to understand. I need to understand how a technology actually works. How is it actually made? What is its maturity potential? What is the market potential around it? What is the policy direction? Only then can I have a good grasp of this. Okay. Now, one of the things, and this is sort of the history thing. So we started Climake in 2020. So Simi and I, my co-founder, we kind of came together just to get a sense of the very simple thing, like why is so much of climate finance stuck in renewables and mobility? Why is it not moving out to other places? We tried to look at what research was there, and we found pretty much everything was historical. And one of the fundamental things around, especially in climate finance, is past trends are not an indicator of future trajectories. I give a very simple explanation. I don't know how many of you have seen this. This is probably the most, I would say, well-known diagram around climate finance. So this is by the Climate Policy Initiative. They call it the octopus diagram. So every 2 years, they bring out this thing called the landscape of climate finance, both at the global level and at an India level. And this is pretty much the only thing people read in that whole report. No one reads anything else in the report, which is a shame because it's actually a good report. But what it does is it looks at historically where has climate finance flown. Now, if you look at the sectors on the right, you'll see that energy systems has a huge chunk. It's almost more than half of mitigation, and it's more than half of the 653 number. Transport, if you just combine these two things, that's almost 500 billion when you're talking about a total of 653 billion. Now, the problem is, if you just look at this column in the middle, we know adaptation, for example, is a pressing need. Where I'm in Chennai right now, it's almost like 40 degrees apparently, and in April, which is absolutely ridiculous. So we are aware that adaptation is something that has to pick up. But if you kind of go by this, and if I have to extrapolate from historical data, I will not see that adaptation is going to become the critical need coming forward. So this is one fundamental problem that we found. But I will still say this is important information because it at least gives us a sense of seeing where are things going. We know what sort of capital is there. We know how it's being deployed. We know where it's being used, because this gives us the opportunity to go back and say that, you know what, there's too much of capital which is going towards mitigation. We need more to go towards adaptation. There's too much of public finance which is going towards adaptation. We need more private finance to go towards stuff. But the problem with most of these reports is they don't say this parts that I've been telling you. And that's where, when we looked at research, we realized that, and we just want to look at a simple thing in 2020, that where do we think climate finance is going to go by 2025 and by 2030 in India? We had no answer. We had no clue where exactly it would go. So, and that's what we realized, that most research is historical and it does not do enough to provide direction to decision makers. And there is a reason, obviously, why it's difficult, because it's very tricky. You're talking a lot about a subject which is nascent. We have no idea how a technology breakthrough may actually happen. We have no idea how a policy breakthrough may actually happen. And I just want to spend a bit of time on this idea of policy, because in India, at least, policy influence directs how climate action is going to go. You can make the most viable product as possible, because climate products, especially mitigation products, is an alternative to something that's out there. So you have this whole debt of dealing with existing solutions and technologies that you have to overcome. It is always going to be a hump. It's always going to be tricky to do. So policy, for example, if a policy is introduced, it will catalyze the sector. We have seen this really, really well in the waste and circularity sector. 3 years ago, it was such a it was such a tiny semi-formal sector struggling to make something happen. EPR policies came in a way that it was very directed towards creating action towards end outputs of high quality recycling. It's catalyzed lithium-ion battery recycling, high-quality bottle-to-bottle recycling. These are things where there was never an incentive for this to pick up. So, and the thing is that something like the plastic e-waste EPR policy has been around since 2011. It was not effective until 2022. So even the presence of a policy coming in is not a guarantee of something picking up, because it needs to be an effective policy. So this is basically one of those things that on the drop of a hat, something can just completely catalyze. We do an annual report called the State of Climate Finance every year, because, and we are okay with the fact that what we said last year may be very different from this year, because that's just the nature of the sector that we are in. And that's how we just have to deal with it. I kind of suspect this is also a reason why a lot of people don't do this future direction part in such a concrete manner, because it is very hard to make it accurate and clear. But what we do is that we look at as many factors to give the best sort of answer that we can actually give for this. But we also give it as a caveat to say that this is just an initial introduction to it. And I'll talk a bit more about the state of climate finance a bit later. And this is a graph which just talks about the TRL and CRL levels of technologies. And it just exemplifies how most of the stuff that you see. So below is the blue line, the blue arrow is what's the TRL level, and it's the technology readiness level. When it crosses beyond like around this part here, which is around TRL 11, that's when you know you have a marketable, fully scalable product. But then there's an entirely another sector around whether it's actually a viable adoption product, which is where the commercial readiness level comes in. It's only at this level where it's at 6, where you can actually say that this is a viable product which will actually have scale potential to come into the picture. And this is a projection by 2030 globally, which obviously means it's mainly in developed economies and global north economies. So this is not something which is obviously contextualized for the Indian context. So this just calls to the fact that these things can just catalyze so quickly. But it's something that is important, because without providing that direction, you're never going to be able to get to a stage to actually definitively tell the key decision makers. And in our case, the main one we deal with is funders and investors, what exactly they should be focusing on investing, because to some extent, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I can tell them that more capital, there's greater opportunity, they'll put in more capital, and then more capital will lead to the greater option being realized. So this is why we have a role to play in actually influencing a lot of what actually can happen. Sorry, yeah. So I think these two things are big bang statements, which you would have definitely heard. India calls for 1 trillion for climate finance for developing economies. In COP29, countries agreed 300 billion. Big question mark of whether this is actually even going to happen now. But the problem with all these big numbers is that it doesn't tell you the next thing of where is it going to go? What is it actually going to get intended for? Now, one of the things that you'll hear very often, especially if you work in the finance side of this, is that people will say there's a lot of money in climate. That's a statement I absolutely hate, and it's super annoying, because there is potentially a lot of capital available, but this capital is not getting deployed. That's why we use the word finance flows. Finance has to actually flow into something, but we don't really see that happening enough here. So when we looked at all of these factors, we realized the fundamental problem is that there is not enough data-driven research, which actually gives an outlook to say where exactly is a particular sector going to go, why is it going to go in that way, and what's the financing context which is required for that particular sector. Okay? So this is a broad thing of what we do in Climate. We do predominantly 4 things, but research and thought leadership underpins everything that we do. Without research and thought leadership, we cannot go to funds and actually do the advocacy that we do in advising them on their thesis approach and the strategies. We can't really do the new financing approaches and structures that we propose. We've done the first carbon credit backed loan in India. We've deployed like a very innovative asset leasing product. We're working on the first private adaptation fund. We can't do any of these things without actually having a solid understanding of research. So One of the things that we're very keen on when we talk about research is we use the word action research, which is that any research that we do, any research that we partner with someone has to have an outcome which actually leads to something. We don't like things, we don't want something where we don't see the potential for it to actually be implemented and where it just ends up as a report. That's just a personal choice that we take, because I think both Simi and I are at that level wherein, we just want to see things happen rather than just try and make a nice looking report that be produced. This is just like a summary of just to put a bit of color. I thought I'd just show you some of the reports that we published over the last 3-4 years. This is all pretty much public reports. We also do private reports. And the things on top here is the state of climate finance is like an annual report that we do every year, where we look to kind of encapsulate and talk about where we think what has happened in India last year and where we think particular sectors are going to go from a trend and trajectory perspective. And we also try and give in some extra elements. So for example, in the 2023 version, we spoke a lot more detail about the types of investors and the financing frameworks that need to be there. In the 2024 report, we spoke a lot about what exactly we think the investment need is needed by 2030 in India. So what we do in these reports, and I don't know if you've read them, but there's a bit of a pressy in that way and a bit of marketing for that, I guess. What we actually do in these reports is we give a very concise focus to talk about, for that particular sector, what do we think at this point of time and in the imminent future, say the next year, what is going to be the key driver for that sector. So when we talk about something like storage systems, this report, for example, emphasized around the policy that's been introduced called for energy storage systems, wherein discoms have to adopt a certain amount of energy from battery storage systems. And this is now a policy and law. So we focused on that, and we spoke about how that can actually be a driver for adoption of energy storage. We didn't talk about the technology need, the innovation need for this and all that. We spoke about one specific driver for picking it up, because what we want to talk about when we do the state of climate finance is to start putting in initial talking points and give an overview so that people are aware and they have a sense of this is all that's there out there. And if they want to do a deep dive, we have hyperlinks, and obviously then people can end up talking to us as well. So we're also strategic on how we use research in different ways. We have done some couple of more focused research. So this research in the middle is a report we did with a bunch of people in Southeast Asia, where we looked at this concept called demand-led investment, wherein we saw an example of few companies and few funds who were not sort of setting out their investment focus upfront to say that I want to invest 500K, 2x return potential in the next 2 years, that sort of thing, and then trying to find pipeline. They were first trying to find pipeline, and then they wanted to then see, okay, what is the most suitable structure that will work for that particular company? That's what we call demand-led investment. So this was, for example, we wanted to do a research about that because we felt it's a focus area. This is a way that financing should actually go. Just think about it, that if an enterprise is able to engage with the funder and say, this is what works for me, but this is the concession I can do. So you're able to do very tailored solutions. You're more likely to increase the odds of success for that particular institution. So we did a research which is pretty much around this concept, you can call it. We've done this research with Andy, the Aspen Network of Global Development Entrepreneurs, which is around waste and circularity, because they have waste and circularity as a very key plank for the next 3 years. And they identified when they spoke with funds that a lot of funds don't really have a sense of what the thesis structure could be like, what the basic opportunity in waste and circularity could be. So we did a five report series looking at what's the introductory landscape towards what the sector could be like. And then we did very specific guides for the 4 leading high potential sectors in this. So this is an element of, as you can see, like all these things, our main audience, what we look at is investors and funders. And this is how we start looking at influencing and creating that one thing that I said to provide better direction for better decision making. So I'll come to a couple of parts that we can talk about, but I'm happy to stop here for now. If there's any questions, any perspectives, we can take a bit. It also gives me a chance to drink some water because I've been talking a bit. Okay, I think my water break is short then. Okay, that's fine. So let me go ahead then. Okay, so the 3 things I just want to kind of cover briefly. First is frameworks and tools. The second one is just sort of what to kind of keep an eye out in looking at research, and that is going to be more of a conversational thing. And the last one is also what should you look at if you're looking at what sort of skills should you really be approaching things with when you're doing research, which, as I said, I'm not a trained researcher by a particular formal method, but these are perspectives that I've seen have been most effective in what we do. So starting with frameworks and tools, for us, frameworks, we're not too hard and fast on certain things, but frameworks for us are critical for providing structure of what we want to do. Because ultimately, the output that we create of a research should be an actionable message that can be adopted and taken somewhere. So fundamentally, when we look at frameworks, we are looking at it as a way of providing us that outline for a particular focus that we're looking at to say, okay, this is what it has to be done. But it's not a very crucial part for us. Yes, there are I got examples of specific types of framework like the PESTLE analysis, which is great for doing a landscape of say across different geographies, what is the climate potential, or within a particular sector, what's the different drivers from a political, legal, social context, and so on. But those are things which you can pick up and see. It's not rocket science to really figure that out. But the biggest thing that we have always found is this thing of data. And it kind of goes back to this whole thing that climate and climate finance data is so nascent. It's very tricky to find. Like even a simple thing is just trying to find the market size of a normal sector. Like we've been doing a lot of work on cooling. Trying to find the market size of cooling is a nightmare to find like a credible piece of information, because some of these things just do not exist. So I have a piece later that I want to talk about of how we have actually formulated data by collating and bringing together a lot of data points. But I will feel that that's kind of the more common thing that you'll end up having to do if you're doing something on climate finance and climate research around that. So this, for example, is the mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive framework, something which sort of it's good to kind of keep in mind before you start off the work that you do. Now, what this basically means is that if you're looking at doing a research in a particular aspect, a particular angle, you need to have to structure it in a way that you're basically identifying everything that needs to be covered, and your scope of how you're going to do your analysis is proper. But at the same time, you're kind of bracketing it enough into different areas wherein each can be covered on its own. So I'll get into a more specific example later, but very simply, if I want to do an investment potential scan of particular sectors, I look at perhaps 4 or 5 key areas to drive this. So I look at what's the market potential, what's the technology maturity, what's the policy direction, and what's the current financing potential for this, or current number of enterprises there. Okay, so that will give me the sense of the categories that I have to account for. And I may want to do this, and we did this for the waste sector. We do this across 10 waste sectors. So the mutually exclusive parts are each of the waste streams. We're able to categorize them separately, but we're able to compare them collectively by bringing this particular category so that we can look at understanding each and every aspect of a waste stream and compare it against one another. So when we kind of start out our work, this is basically the starting point of anything that we do. And this is a process of refinement all the time, because ultimately the sort of framework, the sort of outputs that you create, you're getting a lot of data to come in to kind of justify that output. Sometimes you'll find that you've missed out on a particular key influencing data point, and you have to change your categories in place. So this is something that I think even McKinsey uses, but we have found it super useful to kind of just get those structures in place, because once you kind of get the structures in place, you then know what sort of data to actually target and get into it. Okay, so I'll give you an example. So this is for the report we did on demand-led investing. And what we wanted to do in this was we wanted to correlate so Village Capital has this thing called the viral framework, which talks about the maturity of an enterprise. And we wanted to kind of correlate that with the aspect on how different enterprises are able to access capital based on the level of where they are on this. So for us, the categories that we've identified are these 8 aspects: team, problem, vision, value proposition, and so on. And the different dividers that we looked at, which we're comparing against, are the different types of enterprises. So for example, I don't have that here. Okay. I thought I had a slide which actually gave a final example. So all that we're doing as part of the data work that we're doing is to identify information for each of these 8 different things. The viral framework also that we looked at is very geared towards, tech-focused companies and growth and everything. But we realized that when we're looking at the impact sector and the solutions we were looking at, this whole exit component of it was not really an option. So we downplay the level of data and the weightage that we gave to that particular thing. So this is, again, going to the part of refinement. Okay. This is another thing that we had done with an internal report around, actually, it was more the Andy report that we had actually done on waste and waste management. What we did was we wanted to, again, compare across these 10 sectors, what are the most high potential investment potential sectors. So the categorizations that we did were what's here on the investment potential area, market size and growth, investability of pipeline, product readiness, policy support, and financing gaps and need. And we then classify them to very specific quantifiable and quantitative data points. So all the work and all the data that we did was to basically try and fill up these points as effectively as possible. We tried to go for quantitative data as much as possible because that's easy to kind of align and aggregate and compare. But we knew in certain instances you need quantitative data. So at certain points, we kind of combined the two. But we basically did like a 100-page report just to create this output. Because ultimately, the aim that we wanted to do was to say that what are the most investable sectors in India for waste and circularity. So we had to go back to define how do we think investment potential could work, how can those broader investment potential areas be answered, and then kind of see, do we have enough, is this comprehensive enough for us to actually justify over this? In this case, that whole, how we did the mutually exclusive part of things was quite easy because we just went by different waste streams as one separate part, one separate group. So now this particular type of work that we're doing where the output is a ranking framework is surprisingly very common for us right now. And I think a big part of that is because of where we are and the focus that we have on working on emerging sectors and emerging areas. Investment potential and understanding what is the next big thing is a huge reason for why we get to do a lot of our research work. So this whole process that we do with the framework of the MECE framework is super useful for what we can do here. Another thing that this is not really a formal framework, but I think this is actually one of the more important things. And I think probably because of the lack of a formal training, I feel the more analytical side of research is a lot more important than your ability to parse and data crunch and get numbers from things. Because that part, you can find many ways to do it. AI is also super helpful for that. But really getting something which actually you can structure and put in place effectively is a lot more difficult and a lot more tricky. Because when you're basically developing a research, you very often have a hypothesis in place. You have a clear conclusion that you have in place. So storyboarding works when you know what you want to say. So think if you've done all this internal research, now you have to create the output. You basically want to see what is the most effective way that I can actually provide this messaging in place. So this is more of about a way of thinking. And surprisingly, a lot of people miss out on this a lot because very often you'll see a storyboarded research structure, which is quite ineffectively done, where key conclusions are not effectively directed and not effectively connected to the corresponding or the next structure in place. One of the ways that we just think of this in a very similar format is when we put a piece of information out, we think, so what? The so what has to then lead into something else. It then has to lead into something else. So for us, a formalized way of calling that is what we call around storyboarding. We find this a super critical need. So when we do a report, we kind of structure the entire report out first before we start filling it in. So and that's especially when we already know what the hypothesis is like, or we have an idea of what we want to communicate effectively. So yeah, like I was saying, a pestle analysis is then this is sort of the realm of very specific frameworks of how you want to measure and compare things. This is a very quantitative thing. It's not really the most intuitive aspect there because you really can't compare. It's kind of on the level of a SWOT to an extent because it doesn't really tell you too much. It doesn't really require you too much to get into the weeds of something. But we find this kind of useful, especially if you're doing a macro sort of setup. So this is just as an example. I just want to share this. But I think one of the more important things aside from frameworks and everything is just the ability to validate data. One of the things that we prioritize quite a lot is all our research that we do, and because it's very nascent research, almost every structure or every aspect that we cover, we work with an expert to validate what we want to do. And the big reason for that is very likely the information that we have is not present, or we just don't have something which is available for this in place. The other thing that we do is also data sources are super critical. We're very particular on who we take. When it comes to reports, for example, the likes of a McKinsey and so on are actually really good reports to validate and look to. And it's also kind of critical to your World Banks, your IFCs and all that. They're all credible research organizations. So the reason for being is doing research. They have stature. They have an aspect wherein you can sort of rely that they could be good. Not always, but they could be good. But one of the things we've realized is because we're working on I would say the boundaries of very new information, a lot of the work that we do requires reading research reports from academia and universities and other organizations. And those can get a bit, how do you say, loose because while you can sort of prioritize and say, okay, I'm only going to focus on like IIMs, IITs, NITs and all that stuff, or globally recognized institutions, the fact that a lot of the research that you end up getting from there is so niche, they could be specialized in very specific areas and places. And that becomes very tricky to actually validate and say, is a research paper actually credible for use? So one of the ways that we have actually found this works is obviously very simple things like citations, the number of times it's actually been referenced and so on. And sometimes it just requires us reading through and seeing, does it actually make sense and seeing where do they draw their conclusions of the information from. But one of the biggest aspects, regardless of any structure or whatever you do, is the validity of whatever insight and data that you put out. What we do is we do something called a 2 eyes system, wherein when we create a report, we actually have the insights of something validated by an expert, or we run it by an expert to say, this is what our conclusions are, this is what we feel, does this make sense? Sometimes when we are creating information and data points that we need to gather, we work with an expert to do that, because for the lack of anything being that's an expected thing that's in place. It's not entirely foolproof, because there's only, at a certain point of time, we're still working a lot on assumptions. But what you're trying to do is ultimately, there's an element wherein the numbers that you're providing, the key data points you're providing, it's so if you're able to at least capture the intent of and the direction of where it's going to go, that is fine, because the odds are that data point is not going to stick. because of how dynamic the space is. So that's one thing where we've seen people obsess a lot about specific points, while on the inverse, they've not cared at all about specific points. We've dealt with reports like that, which has been quite an absolute nightmare to deal with. So I just want to touch a bit about key elements to look out for. But before that, again, if there's any questions, please do let me know. Happy to take a conversation at any point of time.
Hi, Shravan. I think Darshana wanted you to explain MEC in detail if possible. Like,
sorry, the MEC, is it?
Yeah.
This one. Yeah. Okay. So, okay. So I'll tell you where this sort of gets used at. The main place that it actually is useful to use is when you have a idea about what the output is going to be for a particular structure. Okay. So, for example, when we do the state of climate finance, we are clear about what we want to communicate in terms of climate finance is not a good one to do. The Andy report on the investment potential for the waste sectors. We know that ultimately we want to talk about what is the investment potential. We don't know which are the sectors in place. We don't know what exactly the ranking is going to be. So this is in a situation wherein you know sort of the boundaries of what you want to cover, and you're doing something comparable fundamentally. Okay, so you want to see how does it actually compare across different sectors, because at a certain point of time, most of the work, at least that that we found ourselves doing at this point of time, relates to this whole thing of anything that you end up, all the elements that you end up covering have to have some commonality for why they're tied together. Okay, so in this part, the identify problem part and the key issue that we're looking at is we're looking at understanding what is the investment potential of waste sectors in that specific categories. The way that we've done the whole breaking down of these categories, of these key factors, is an element of all those different, is an element of this investment potential criteria and these sectors areas. So because they are cross-cutting, because in one element, we know that we want to compare a range of different things, but then we also have to understand and see what are we going to compare against. So there's a two-layer thing that we're looking to understand. And those are the key factors that we're looking to populate and fill in. So for example, we then prioritize these 10 sectors based on just what was available information to say what is measurable information on waste. So there were a couple of more extra sectors we could have taken, but we didn't take it because we didn't have information. So that kind of fixed our factor focus. And this was a lot easier to fix. This element on the investment potential criteria was a lot more tricky because it's very dynamic for us to know, because this is what we're going to be measuring these different factors, these different areas against. And for example, this part on policy support, just this one particular point on whether a raw material supply is affected by imports. This was a criteria point that we realized was a very critical thing later on. So we have to recalibrate the whole structure in place. Okay. So, so when we come into this particular, so at this point of time, we've got a categories in place. We know what we kind of want to outline, and we have a sense that the categories we've identified are exhaustive for the area that we want to look at. The analysis part is obviously where we start identifying data, start identifying insights, and seeing whether it's actually exhaustive or is it actually effective enough to understand what needs to be captured effectively. So like I was giving the example of raw material imports having a significant impact on whether the potential for waste sectors. That was something that we then had to understand better when we did the whole refinement, when we had to refine our process better, because we understood a data point which we had not captured earlier. So the way we look at this whole NEC structure is from this very specific perspective, that when the climate sector we need to be talking, there is an element of talking about comparatives to some extent. And there's an element of talking about how do we actually identify, the opportunities which are in place. And this has to be to some level based on what are the key driving factors that are actually going to enable it. This is how we actually outline. I hope that's kind of clear. Yeah, Dhruv, you have a question.
Thank you, Shravan, for a very insightful presentation. And I'd like to ask a bit of a question that's pertaining to me. So sorry for that, everyone. But,
no problem. Yeah.
So I'm someone who comes from a finance background. In terms of my education, I'm doing something completely else right now. If I want to get into climate finance, how important is the technical know-how of what's really happening here and the basics of it? And depending on how important it is, how should I go about learning it?
Okay, when you're talking about, okay, actually I'll come to that later because I got a couple of more areas I'll just quickly cover and we'll come to that. But I just want you to qualify one thing when you say technical aspects. Are you talking about technical aspects around research or climate finance in general?
Climate finance in general.
Okay, I'll come into that a bit later. Okay, I'll just quickly wrap this up because I didn't realize the time when I saw that I've been speaking for quite a bit, so I do apologize. Okay, so because I just wanted to highlight a couple of key things that I like to bring up this problem because it even shows even the most potentially infallible solutions are problematic. And there's a whole key aspect on data veracity, which is just not effectively captured. So this was a report done by the World Bank on cooling opportunities in 2023. And just keep an eye out for this number of 1.25 trillion for residential building and 2.228 billion. So basically it says the market for cooling, okay, is 1.5 trillion, and they've added these two things together. Okay, so that's how it works. So they've basically made a statement saying that cooling opportunity is 1.5 trillion. But here they said the green buildings market, but they're not really explained how it works further. When we kind of look back and we looked at this, so this is kind of an important point because this document is actually informing a lot of policy work in India around cooling systems. Okay, like India is looking to set up like a financing structure to support cooling adoption, and this report is basically directly feeding and enabling that in some way. And so we looked at, this is like a trajectory which talks about, how cooling is going to evolve in the next 20 years. And somehow the numbers really didn't make sense because it didn't seem like, a less than 4x increase being a market which is worth 1.5 trillion. We didn't think that India's current cooling market is worth 600 billion. Because that's like a huge, huge market. Big, but not that big. And then we realized that this number basically has come from an IFC report, which only talks about buildings. It does not talk about cooling. Now here, this is a very egregious problem because you have a piece of document which is actually very influential, but is based on very faulty data. And this whole issue of data veracity is where, and this is something we actually flagged up with the World Bank folks because we spoke to them. We got a very weird answer where they said, well, this is already quite far down the line, so we don't have the capacity to actually go back and correct it. So I just wanted to point out the fact that when you're looking at data points and data veracity, it's a very critical thing to really double check and see whatever points and whatever numbers are actually in place that really speak to you. Just because it's from a credible institution, you need to really understand and see where exactly the backing is actually coming effectively. Okay, so I just want to quickly touch upon this and get into the skills part. Then Dhruv, I'll get into your question. The whole idea about research fundamentally is that you have to have abilities around data, around generating insights and messaging. And like I was talking about the whole storyboarding concept, this is almost flowing through what actually comes in with this. I just want to give you an example of this particular graph. This comes in our report on the 2024 State of Climate Finance. It's a simple graph, but it's the most complex graph that we've ever done because none of this information exists anywhere. If you look at any sort of information, only our report has this particular piece of information. So what we wanted to do was that we wanted to identify what is the potential extractable amount of precious materials in e-waste generated in India by 2030. And we couldn't find that anywhere. But it's a very important, useful data point because e-waste recycling has got like the zeitgeist moment. A lot of people are interested in that. So we basically had, and this is kind of how we consolidated the whole thing. So we basically had to make data. We worked with an expert who, the most credible publication globally on e-waste is called the Global E-Waste Monitor. We worked with an expert who works on that. And we basically had to break down and understand what was the e-waste potential in India currently, what was the e-waste per capita number, what is the GDP per capita number. We had to consolidate, I think, 5 different data sets which spoke about the composition of precious metals and metals generally in PCBs and aggregate all of this together to kind of make a correlation to it. So the reason I wanted to quickly just give you this example is that at a certain point of time, and very likely, especially around climate, you're not going to find data which suits you and works for how you want. And the best way that we've found is actually kind of comes together is that there's a need to understand how data works and actually passing through data because we have to pass through a lot of data to get into that. But then converting that into something effective also is important because we looked at, we had to take 4 different data sets and kind of bring them together. So it requires a bit of an analytical understanding to see how does conversion work? How does actual understanding of correlation work? Because we wanted to get a number for what is the e-waste generation in 2030. And we had to account for that based on other proximate examples of other countries and other example situations that were in there. So one of the most important skills ultimately ends up becoming analytical skills. I think technical skills are useful in some way, but it's really only for data-heavy projects. I don't know if a lot of you know about this person called Rukmini S. She's written this amazing book called I think Half Truths and Whole Numbers, if I'm not mistaken. And she's a person who is probably one of the finest data scientists in the country, and she doesn't do any sort of
It's otherwise. It's whole numbers and half truths.
That's the one. Sorry, yeah, whole numbers and half truths. And I remember listening to her, and she was talking about how she still believes in manually going through data, and that's how she found out a lot of the insights as well. So for me, and very often when you look at research and data, you'll very often see technical understandings being created. It's useful, but it's not crucial. For example, I have none of these technical skills. My team does not have any of these technical skills. But what we prioritize more, what we think is more effective is really analytical skills. How you actually convey something, how you actually plan something. And as a result from that, what we've sort of seen being picked up when you're trying to show that you have research skills, for example, is just the nature of the type of work that you've done. That's the most effective way to really qualify and talk about your credibility and your experience in this particular way. It's very difficult to sort of put research as a skill identity without even qualifying that. And it's very difficult to actually connect that with education and technical skill qualifications. So this is kind of a way that we have seen, at least I've seen when we work with a bunch of research collaborators, and the way that we actually identify and work with them is just by understanding how do they do their thinking. Because if we are able to, for example, guide them towards the right data, the most critical part is how do you actually convey the data in an effective way. Okay? Now I want to go back to Dhruv's question. Dhruv, sorry, could you just repeat that? And when you say technical skills, I'm assuming you mean the skills related to the financing part of it. Is that correct?
Yes, and more towards pertaining to the environmental.
Yeah. See, so you definitely do need finance understanding. That's pretty crucial fundamentally. But climate finance, again, it has a couple of different parts to it. Because if you're on the side that's working with supporting startups to raise capital, you need the whole investment banking suite of understanding and information that's in place. So that's ideally if you have a CA background, if you have maybe CFA as a qualification which is in place. Those are two things which are super useful. Having said that, I have neither of those things. Again, I've learned all of this basically through experience and through understanding. The more important thing so where I think there's two elements of climate finance. Okay, there is this whole research part that we do, wherein we're trying to set out the outline of how we can actually build the case for it. There's a climate finance enablement part of it, and that's two elements. That's you working with an investor to tell them how they should be focusing, and you supporting a startup to actually raise capital, or support an enterprise to raise capital. I'll just start with the fund and the enterprise angle. These two things require completely different skills. It's not necessarily the same. Because when I'm trying to convince and work with a fund manager, for example, I talk about it from a macro perspective. I'm trying to show them an opportunity. I'm trying to show them a wider perspective. So showing them industry experience, showing them and understanding that how I understand a particular sector goes a long way towards actually them understanding a particular space. The additional thing where it's important for them to build your credibility is your knowledge and your ability around financing structures. But that doesn't have to go to the minutiae of understanding and saying, okay, I know how to read super detailed financing documents and all that. That is a benefit for sure. But the more important thing is whether you have a grasp of understanding, this is what is really a particular structure that could work. This is how it could be designed and be developed in place. It's obviously a lot easier if you have a financing background, because that goes a long way towards answering, I think, more of the technical parts, because frankly, the other part is all very analytical based. I think a good way to kind of start things out is always, if you have a particular industry focus and making that your first domain, and then building on through from that to showing credibility within that sector, because one of the main things around climate especially is to demonstrate opportunity and showing how do you see that opportunity can evolve in a particular space. And that is really based on your understanding of a particular area. It doesn't require the most fundamental understandings about how of parsing through financing documents and so on. That's the next stage that comes after it. But this first stage is fundamentally pretty critical. So the work that we do, for example, we have an investment banking division. So the team that works on that, they have a solid understanding on the financing side of things, but we have researchers who have no knowledge about that. They have no experience around that. So this is again an entry point through which you can actually start getting into it. The second part around skills for IB, for investment banking, is something you can definitely learn through a course. That is 100% there. The first part is something which tends to be a lot more intuitive. It's a bit harder to. So, for example, I've seen folks who kind of write thesis documents around a particular sector as part of practice to understand how well do I understand the sector, how well do I understand the aspects of it. So, it requires definitely both these two different things. Yeah. Any other questions? And I know it's time for a wrap up soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you so much.